Hey, y'all, and welcome to the second short lecture from Chapter 4 in your textbook. In this short lecture, we're going to talk about Elton Mayo, or more about Elton Mayo, and his work in the Hawthorne studies. So, Elton Mayo, who was really sort of a central figure in this human relations school, argued that the experience of the average worker was very similar to the experience of post-traumatic stress victims during wartime. Right? He looked at the way people were working in these factories, where as we talked about with the Triangle Shirtwaist fire, they were working under very poor conditions, working crazy hours, uh, and generally appeared to be understandably quite dissatisfied with their work. And he argued that these bad conditions and the intensity of the labor really sort of created a situation that wasn't too different than one that vets experienced after World War One, when they came home shell shocked and experiencing PTSD. He also argued that the workplace was the primary site for the creation of identity. And what that means is that he understood that people, when it came to thinking about themselves, the workplace really formed a key part of who they thought they were, right? And we know that this is true even today, right? If you meet somebody at a party, you might ask them, a common question might be, so what do you do, right? As if someone's job, what they do during the day, excuse me, at work really says something about who they are, that's part of their personality, that's part of their self, right? And he observed that workers of the time were generally alienated from one another, so meaning that they didn't really have an opportunity to relate to one another, to get to know each other, to form friendships, to form bonds amongst one another. And as a result, he argued that workers need social collaboration. They need to be able to socialize. They need to be able to interact with one another. And argued ultimately, as I pointed out in the last lecture, that this can only really be achieved by trained administrative elites. So in other words, people needed to be able to have a positive identity that they create in this workplace. They needed to be able to effectively and informally communicate with one another as well as management. But this could only be done, this can only be achieved through the work of the people in charge, right? It's not up to the workers to be able to do this on their own. It's up to the managers to create a workplace environment where this can happen, right? So your book tells us Mayo had a well-developed political philosophy that placed the solution to industrial and societal ills not in a broad agenda of social and economic reform, but in the application of psychological principles to the transformation of individual attitudes and dispositions towards the labor process. So, to unpack this a little bit, right? What they're saying is that he thought you could solve problems at work and in society not through a bunch of social and economic reform, right? You didn't have to pay the people more, you didn't have to worry about their social position. What you had to do was figure out, using psychology, right, and psychological principles, how you could transform people's individual attitudes concerning how they thought about work. And he thought this was the job of management, right? So a lot of this comes out of studies, a group of famous studies known as the Hawthorne studies that were conducted between 1924 and 1933, so over the course of 9 years, at a Western electric plant in Cicero, Illinois. And here they investigated the importance of physical, economic, and social variables and how they affected employee behavior and attitudes. And what they found was really kind of surprising. Now, normally I skip videos, but I think this one's really informative, and it probably does a better job of telling you about the Hawthorne effect than I can do. So I'm going to go ahead and play this, and I want you to watch it.
Welcome to Alanis Business Academy. I'm Matt Alanis, and this is the Hawthorne Effect. The Hawthorne Effect was a product of a series of studies conducted at the Hawthorne Works plant of Western Electric beginning in the late 1920s. Used to produce switches and relays, the Hawthorne Works plant was located in Cicero, Illinois, which is just outside of Chicago. Western Electric would later develop into Ma Bell, which was broken up in the 1980s due to competition concerns and created what we now know as AT&T. Leading the Hawthorne studies was an Australian psychologist named Elton Mayo, who, along with his colleagues at the Harvard Business School, was attempting to determine whether or not changes in the physical environment would affect worker productivity. Over the course of the study, Mayo and his colleagues altered the frequency and duration of rest periods, the length of a workday, employee compensation, temperature settings, and even lighting to see how such changes would impact worker productivity. The researchers hypothesized, among other things, that increasing the frequency of meal periods would increase productivity, while decreasing lighting levels would decrease productivity. To the amazement of the researchers, these changes and many others resulted in increased worker productivity. So why did this happen? While researchers were using temperature, lighting, and duration of rest periods, i.e. the independent variables, to explain the impact on productivity, i.e. the dependent variable, they failed to consider another important independent variable at work, attention. It seemed that the employees being studied were not in fact responding to changes in the physical environment, but were in fact responding to the increased attention they were receiving during the study. This increased attention appeared to have caused employees to feel as if they were special for being singled out during the observation period. Although several flaws in the Hawthorne studies exist, like the absence of a blind study to measure the impact of knowingly being observed and the extraordinarily small sample size, the Hawthorne studies are considered to be one of the most important studies in human relations. For the first time ever, there was research that shed light on other factors beyond pay that could lead to increased worker productivity. Also, the study altered the common perception of employees as merely appendages of machines. So what is the Hawthorne effect? The Hawthorne effect is the phenomenon in which subjects alter their behavior in response to being observed. Think about your own behavior when your supervisor is nearby, or a police officer is traveling behind you down the street. Do you increase or elevate your performance, or maybe even alter your behavior? Chances are you answered yes, and this is the Hawthorne effect at work. Although this isn't earth-shattering in the 21st century, this research was groundbreaking during the 1930s. More importantly, the Hawthorne studies led to greater interest in the study of human relations, spawning work by well-known motivational theorists such as Maslow, McClellan, McGregor, and Herzberg. This has been the Hawthorne effect. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment box below, and I'll do my best to get back to those in a timely.
Okay, so hopefully you get the idea from this short video, but to sort of recap or to sum up, the idea is that when they were studying workers in this factory, they changed a bunch of the physical elements in their working environment, right? Lighting, temperature, things like that. And what they found out eventually was that there were changes in productivity, but those changes weren't really attributable. Increased productivity, for example, wasn't attributable to better lighting or colder temperatures, but was instead related simply to the fact that the employees were being watched, that they were being observed. And so what the Hawthorne effect maintains is that just watching someone at work can enhance their productivity. And if we take that a step further, if we go back to Jeremy Bentham and that idea of the panopticon from the first chapter in your book, right, that operates along the same lines that the Hawthorne effect does, right? So in essence, the idea here is you don't even really have to observe them. The workers just have to think that they're being observed in order to increase productivity. The more attention you give the worker, right, or that you seem to give the worker, the more productive they become, right? In one way, you can look at it and say, increased attention to the worker makes them feel special, and so they work harder, right? Another way you could look at it, of course, would be that monitoring a worker and them just knowing you're watching them scares them into working harder. So there are various interpretations of this. But nevertheless, the Hawthorne effect was an important notion that emerged in the context of organizational communication and in management in general, right? So there are some implications from this, of course. So unlike Taylor, right, with scientific management, Mayo argued that group togetherness or group cohesiveness leads to increased productivity. And this is especially true when there are attitude adjustments that are made on the part of the management, right? When the management actively works to affect workers' attitudes through psychological means, right? So when people feel like they're part of a group, their productivity goes up. He also suggested that informal communication leads to increased efficiency and worker satisfaction. So this is altogether different than what we saw under the terms of scientific management, because here we're encouraging workers to communicate. We want them to feel like they're part of a group in order to achieve something, right? Before, we were trying to limit worker interaction because we didn't want workers to get together and engage in things like systematic soldiering, where they purposefully slowed down the workplace. We didn't want them to get together and form unions, right? So here, this is the opposite. We want people to make strong social bonds with their coworkers because it leads to greater productivity. So a happy worker is a productive worker. And this provides a basis for a bunch of untapped potential for managers to motivate employees. If you can make your workers happy, right, they'll work harder. That's what Mayo said, right? And that's what the Hawthorne studies prove. This is why, for example, we see the Hawthorne effect being employed, or Hawthorne strategies being employed at places like Google, right, where you go in and they have nap pods and they have free breakfast and free food in the cafeteria and they have video games to play and all this kind of stuff, right? The whole idea is that if you keep these people happy, they will be productive. And of course, if you look at the track record of many of these companies like Google, there seems to be something to this, right? So this school uses what we call qualitative methods. So this isn't about necessarily applying the scientific management to theory or the scientific method to the management of employees. This is about qualitative methods. So just looking at what works and anecdotally and using that moving forward. And of course, at the time, this seemed to provide a solution for a lot of the tension between employees and their employers, right? This seemed like a good way, in the context of all this turmoil and conflict between workers and their employers, this seemed like a really good way to solve this problem. Now, there have been a number of criticisms of the Hawthorne studies. When they look at the empirical data from the studies very closely, we see that the link between worker satisfaction and productivity might not hold up. In other words, it might not be reproducible across the board. People who criticize the Hawthorne studies in this way are basically saying that it's not scientifically efficacious or proven, right? There's also an ideological critique of the Hawthorne studies, and they say along these lines that there's no legitimate role for conflict in the workplace, right? So we know that conflict exists in the workplace, and so a lot of people want to use that conflict productively. They want to figure out how to harness it and use it effectively. According to this way of thinking, right, according to what the Hawthorne studies suggest, there is no place for conflict in the workplace. And so people who really follow these Hawthorne studies and use it as a blueprint for their management, they would say, listen, if there's conflict, that's just because you're not doing right by the employees. You're not figuring out how to tap their potential. Also, the people criticize it because they said that, well, this assumes that the manager is the rational figure here, and the worker is always irrational or sentimental, right? So it puts the manager in a position where they're supposed to be rationally superior to their employees. And frankly, we know this not to be true, right? I mean, I've worked for plenty of people who were quite wealthy and quite successful in business and were completely irrational human beings. Also, there's quite a bit of criticism of the Hawthorne studies based on gender bias. Specifically, they argued that the use of female test subjects in an all-male environment really sort of threw off the results, right? That by placing all female test subjects in a predominantly male environment, you're already creating a situation that's abnormal and shouldn't really be used as a yardstick for other workplaces. Okay, so in the next short lecture, we'll talk about Mary Parker Follett. So that's it for this one. Thanks for checking it out.